Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe, followers, likes, double tap.
What is going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We talk business, politics, culture, trends, anything you need to know as an active citizen in our lovely city to keep you informed, to make better decisions, and advocate for the right things so that we continue to build a better future for this great place. I'm with my co-host, Ann Zeta. What's up? How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I love that pitch you just gave, because I think that's exactly what we're here for, is to try to make people as active and engaged as we try to be.
You know, I was excited. So what's cool, I got to see Ann like twice this week because she emceed the Global Entrepreneurship Week event on Friday, which will be a short story that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But while I was impressed, it was the first time I think it was the most you and I were dressed up together. And we didn't take a photo.
Oh, that's really a loss.
Fly,
There's a loss.
You had a fly purple suit on, which I thought was an embodiment of our purple city. And I was like, look at her up there. You know what? She's doing
I got lots of compliments on that suit, too. It was pretty bold. When I left the house, I got outside in the bright light, and I was like, wow, this is way purpler than I anticipated in the more muted light of my house. But then I immediately went to a Creative Mornings event up on Race Street at the Post, and their color scheme includes a lot of purple. And so I was getting compliments right and left on that.
You looked great up there.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. But okay, so how this works, we do 3 short stories, 1 big story, then wins and losses. But we're just going to do a quick update on just kind of where we are with the Kate Granger position, which is an update on Congressional District 12. What are some of our current updates that you've seen this week around who's running, who's not, and now we even got some endorsements?
Yes, I had shared with you a tweet that Bud Kennedy shared saying that Fort Worth Mayor Maddie Parker tells Fort Worth Inc. she's backing Craig Goldman for Texas 12 instead of running because, quote, do I really have to explain why? I feel like it is very similar to a dumpster fire right now. So my take on that was that she was saying that the reason she's not running is because stepping into a congressional seat is like a dumpster fire.
Yeah. And what I do like about that endorsement is it's the more moderate Republican who's running. And again, I think Maddie just did it because Craig is going to have the establishment pump that Maddie had through her candidacy. So this is like, I think you're just going to see the legacy establishment back Craig, which ultimately leads to most likely winning. So, but there's that.
He's the one that has the most money too.
Yeah. And then Ramon Romero also is sticking with his state seat and running for that House seat.
Right. There's a Fort Worth Report article saying that Ramon Romero announced re-election campaign for Texas House District 90. He recently announced this on his 50th birthday as well, that he was running for re-election.
He makes 50 look good, man. You know.
Yeah, yes, he does.
Any person who can have a full set of hair and a beard are automatic 7 out of 10s. You know, like automatic.
So I've known Ramon for a really long time. We served on the zoning commission together, and so pictures pop up in my memory of us going back many, many years. And before he grew that beard, he was definitely younger looking, much more youthful looking back then. So some of that stuff pops up, and I'll send it to him every once in a while just to tweak him a little bit about that stuff. But he serves on the Tarrant Transportation Committee, the House Committee on Transportation and the House Committee on Urban Affairs. And so he definitely has urban stuff in mind and interest. And so I think he is a good person to have down there at the state level, because I think more and more of our state representatives are moving further and further away from the needs of cities and that local control issue. I think he understands. So
yeah, I think for me, why I know I was suggesting that him or Nicole Collier should consider running for the congressional 12 seat. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm not them, but to me, it's just like, man, what can you actually get done in the state of Texas running your head into a brick wall all the time?
Yeah, and your description of that is what loved ones of mine have said to me when I've been asked to consider running at the state level. Why would you want to go down there and beat your head against a wall? But we're lucky and glad that there are people who are willing to do that, because you can't just throw up your hands and do nothing. Yeah. And I think that that's part of what we just said at the top of the show, the importance of being engaged. And it can be frustrating sometimes, but we shouldn't discourage the folks that are willing to do it from doing it.
If I had to do it, I think I would just watch the Rocky movie before every session and then just
pump yourself up and run up the stairs.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now that we are talking about our state politicians, this also leads to our first short story, which will also bring up our House and reps, because the House strikes vouchers from Texas education bill. House Tarrant County lawmakers voted. So what we're looking at is Governor Abbott has called on lawmakers to pass education savings accounts, which will let parents use public tax dollars on their child's private education. He and other supporters of the policy say parents should have a choice on where to send their kids to school, but the program has faced opposition in the House from Democrats and some Republicans who say the program will hurt public schools.
So on Friday, they had a debate, which I actually watched some of. There was, I think, a Texas Tribune article that had the link to the live.
You and all 12 other people, right?
Oh, I think there might have been a few more than that. This was kind of a hot topic. But
no, this is very hot. So yes, keep going.
So they began their debate and looking at provisions, but one of the provisions was to give students about $10,500 in tax dollars each year for private school tuition or other expenses, and homeschool students would get $1,000. So there was an early amendment to strike the vouchers from that bill, and there was an attempt by Arlington Republican Representative Tony Tinderholt to strike down that proposal through a procedural maneuver, but that did not work. So ultimately, the vote was lawmakers voted 84-63 to remove the program from the bill. And this article goes on to say that the Tarrant County delegation votes fell largely on party lines with its 4 Democrat members, Collier, Turner,
Bojani, Adevulis.
Right. And Romero voting to strike the voucher-like policy. This vote represents their collective commitment to public education and serving all students rather than. So joining them was Fort Worth Republican Representative Charlie Guerin, along with 20 other Republicans from across the state. And Guerin indicated that he has always consistently opposed vouchers, and he thinks that it's important to leave that funding in public schools. Then they list off in the article the other representatives in Tarrant County who voted for keeping the vouchers were against removing the vouchers. And that was Capriglione from Southlake, Cook from Mansfield, Goldman from Fort Worth, Click from Fort Worth, and Schlatzline from Fort Worth, and Tinderholt from Arlington all voted to keep education savings accounts in the bill.
So double click here. Craig Goldman of Fort Worth voted for the voucher system. So when we get to elections, just remember all pro-education people and public education to know that the most likely Republican winner who will go against currently that same Democrat from last time was pro-voucher. To me, that's a big scare. I would expect Schlatzline to be pro, but to me, this is a move that can't go unlight if Goldman's going to take the mantle as the moderate Republican. I mean, like, to me, it would be like if Maddie voted yes, which I don't think she would, but you know what I'm saying. Like,
and I don't know that I've ever had a conversation on this topic, other than I did send in my position to my representative, and Goldman is my representative. And I believe I did receive a letter back from him indicating that he appreciated my input. But it was more of a form letter, and it did not signal which direction he was planning to vote. So, that is a reason to continue to communicate with folks and let them know where you stand on these things and ask them where they stand. But the language that this article goes on to quote from the people who wanted to keep the vouchers in there is, I think, very kind of fear-mongering. I mean, it's basically saying that it's anti-freedom, anti-parental empowerment, and anti-Texas. That's some rhetoric that I just think is unfortunate.
Some positives of this, it looks like they're trying to give teachers something in it so that teachers might be for it. It's based on how I see it, right? The increased base amount that schools get per student.
Well, I mean, the bill itself is the funding for school public education. So there is all of the funding to, increase salaries and fund public education. And so I think there's some folks that are the spokespeople for the Texas State Teachers Association who still don't feel like it's enough. Yeah. So even without the vouchers in it, which they were obviously opposed to, that the funding for teacher raises are still inadequate. And the bill's author opted to send the bill back to committee after a vote striking the education savings account and didn't plan to hold another hearing on the bill. But I mean,
so we'll get the
we
good
have
stuff.
To fund education. Yeah. So that's the other stuff that's in the bill is the funding
which
of
is the $6,700 increase per student, and includes 4,000 bonuses for full-time teachers, nurses, counselors, librarians. Those raises will be continued into next school year with the increase per student funding. So that will be where the bill is today, but people want more, is what we're saying.
Yeah, and
Gotcha.
I don't know what they're saying that the increase, the base amount that schools get per student to $6,700, but we're going to give in the voucher program, we would have been giving $10,500 to parents to go to private school. So it just seems crazy that they're taking money. Their proposal was to take money from public schools that are clearly underfunded. If what you're taking is $10,500 to go somewhere else, but you're only funding public education at $6,700. Yeah. And I'll tell you, as someone who sent their kids to private school, even with the tuitions that we paid in private school, we were informed during fundraising time at those private schools that didn't cover how much it costs to actually educate our kids in those private schools, and were asked for money to make up that gap. Yeah. So these vouchers wouldn't even have come close to covering the cost of a private school education.
Yeah, and so my macro, I'm going to go micro and then I'll go macro. Micro, I know people who virtual school their kids through either homeschooling models or virtual schooling models. And here's where I see. Oftentimes when I see these families, they are families who are wanting more independence. But here's where I'm afraid. I feel like these large corporations who run these virtual programs, when you apply for a virtual school or say, hey, I'm going to homeschool our kid, this now allows you to then give your kid a laptop, printer, cameras, all these like science stuff. And so a big box shows up to your house of all this like basically free stuff, because that, in a public school, all that stuff is shared at the school. But now I think where I'm afraid of is that now you're creating a big carrot for the average family who's just like, oh, wow, free stuff that now my kid gets if I put him in homeschooling. And you're talking laptops. Everything that you would have at school is now directly shipped to your house.
Except the teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so to me, like that to me is, I'm seeing more and more families do this and then telling them like, oh yeah, we just got all this stuff. And then I don't know how the education quality, right? But I'm afraid of that happening from a micro lens, and these virtual schools exploiting families on that, trick to get their money from the state or for the federal government as I'm now educating kids. Because now I spent, if I get $10,000 per kid, I just gave you $2,000 worth of stuff. So for you, it looked like you got stuff for free, but I just made $8,000. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. So the profiteering of this model is bad for Texas. But
and I don't think where's the accountability in that?
Yeah.
So in public school, there's measuring and accountability and all
board,
of that.
Yeah.
And what happens at home?
Yeah. So now let me go to the macro part of this. Where Governor Abbott is extremely good at is looking at the macro behaviors of people and seeing where the dangers of protecting his Republican Texas party. He's extremely good at that. And what he sees when him and Dan Patrick sit down, if they ever actually do, and when they sit down and they look at their drawing board and they look at the playbook, they realize that the number one way people become Democrats is in education. And so this whole thing is about two things that he cares about: being a Christian and keeping Texas Republicans. To help fund private schools and most likely religious private schools, what they're seeing is that donations are down in churches. Funding of churches in Texas is down. So if you can get now public education dollars to churches, this is a new funding mechanism that allows them to fund these churches that have had declining attendance across Texas. And so he's trying, this is so important to him to have school choice because it solves, oh, wow, no, now these kids don't go to, the public system that then liberalizes our kids. And then two, it also funds my churches that allows me to put my messaging in across the state of Texas. This is why he's obsessed with this, because as a rural Texas kid who went to a rural school district with one schoolhouse, I had a great education, not because of choice. I had a great education because community supported our school. And you, my friend, are not actually representing rural Texas, who gave me an actual positive rural education experience. One school where every kid from the richest to the poorest was allowed to come together and have a proper education in Texas. And he's trying to dismantle that. And we got to stop seeing education as the villain, and as community members support the full schoolhouses in our rural areas.
I don't think I can say anything to add to that. I think that is great assessment.
What's funny is this probably should have been our big story now that we're 17 minutes in the pod and we're only at short story number 1. But let's go ahead and hit short story number 2, which you have a lot to say here. But this is another part that could probably go for 17 minutes. So we're going to talk about short story number 2, and I'm excited on your take here.
So short story number 2 is a Fort Worth Star-Telegram article entitled "Residents Want Fort Worth Council to Recognize Environmental Racism in Neighborhoods." On Tuesday, the council adopted the city's 2023 comprehensive plan, which has been postponed several times because of some concerns that were raised by a group of folks in the Echo Heights area that have come together and formed the Echo Heights Stop 6 Environmental Coalition. And that coalition has also, I think, spurred a environmental justice group of folks that come from across the city and from some other communities in the region that are basically just saying that we need to start looking at the impacts that environment have. So residents and members of the Fort Worth Environmental Coalition of Communities are looking at the fact that things in the past have risen up out of systemic racism in the past. So if you look at the way that highways have been developed and oftentimes disrupt and go through Black and brown communities, if you look at the way that zoning has been implemented in the past and see that some of your more problematic zoning, like industrial zoning, has been placed in close proximity or on top of neighborhoods that are Black and brown, you will see that there is a systematic thing that has occurred that has led us to where we are today. And there has been in the city of Fort Worth, the way that we've done comprehensive planning over the last 30 years, I think, is that every year the comprehensive plan is looked at and maybe some tweaks are made around the edges. Maybe one section is looked at in more detail, but we're about to enter into a overhaul of the entire comprehensive plan. And what I see holding us back from doing that really well is just this resistance to acknowledge the historical facts that have put us in the position that we're in now. And I know what it's like to sit up on the council dais and have people say things that you personally don't feel apply to you, like calling people who are the policymakers racist. I know what that feels like, but I don't believe that continuing to take that personally is helping us move forward. And I think that the people who are in office now recognize that there are things that they could do to address this and take more into consideration the citizens that they represent. And so this story speaks specifically to what's going on the east side in this area, and the fact that this group of people were able to delay a vote on a specific zoning case, have staff address some of their concerns more broadly by reducing the amount of industrial zoning that was in close proximity to their neighborhood, and not adopt the update to the comprehensive plan until some of those things have been added. And that is what ended up happening on Tuesday. But there is still a concern by these folks and others that this is something that's going to come up again in neighborhoods across the city and should be addressed in an open and engaged fashion. That as we enter into what we're looking at doing a update to the comprehensive plan that is going to be for the entire city, looking at 2050 as the long term where we're going to end up, that these conversations are going to need to be had. And I've pointed out multiple times that zoning hasn't been updated in a lot of years. And so while one person mentioned in the public comments on this topic for the update for 2023 that light industrial zoning has some pretty noxious things allowed in it. So while there are some clean industrial things that maybe don't need to be so heavily separated from where people live and work and play, that's not the way zoning is currently defined and laid out in a lot of cities across the United States. So not only are we needing to kind of look at updating a comprehensive plan, we're needing to look at zoning reform. And that probably went off the topic of what's in this article specifically a little bit, but I think that it definitely is an area where the next steps for the coalition is to go ahead and look at the 2050 comprehensive plan where they can decide what they want for their communities. And that leads us into kind of a conversation that you and I had recently about government engagement and serving on boards and commissions, because these are all places that you can plug into to have a say in the decisions that are made that affect your daily life. Yeah. And government is constantly saying, we try to engage, we send them this, that, and the other thing. We invite them to this public meeting and that public meeting. And citizens are always like, those meetings are not held at times that are convenient for us, or we don't have time at all to go to those kind of meetings. And so I think that the city is moving in a direction of continuing to try to find other ways of engaging. And so there's frustration on both sides. There's people who think that they're not being engaged, and there's people who think that they're doing a job of trying to engage people and just no one is responding to them.
Yeah, I think the number one thing as city officials is getting mad or feeling like you're attacked when people say there's systemic racism. Like everyone needs to not get emotional reaction on that.
Personally triggered. You don't need to be personally triggered by that. Maybe you didn't do this thing that caused this to happen now, but it happened. And there were people who intentionally did it. Yeah.
Yeah. But now what you're talking about, you're 100% correct, where I see both sides. You have the government employee who works really, really hard to like make a decision, write everything down, document it, then inform the public. But then the public commissioner or person who's being the rep at the event then only has to consume what they worked on for 2 weeks in like 30 minutes. Then, the government employee is annoyed because they're trying to tell a bunch of people who don't know what's going on, because they're not the experts. Well, the city people are, but the community reps are not. But then the community reps are supposed to act like experts or like we're representing the city, like our people. And then like everyone's trying to move this thing along. You don't want to be the person who makes the government city official who's just in the system feel bad because they worked really hard on this. And now you're, just trying to get up to speed. But then if you stop it, it's more work to them. And it's just like this weird dynamic where the city employees are the experts, but they're trying to talk to the commissioners or the leaders about something that they just learned about in 30 minutes. And can we move this along? Yes or no? So it just creates a really hard dynamic where the real problem is, should we be discussing why does it work that way?
Yeah, and I think that, you serve on a board or commission. I have served on a board or commission. I have been in the position of city staff in a consulting role, and I have been a policymaker. So I think that, to clearly talk about what we're talking about here is staff presenting material that they've researched and they're subject matter experts on, and they've gone and looked at what other cities do, presenting that to boards and commissions that are made up of regular citizens from the community that shouldn't necessarily be subject matter experts. I mean, I happen to be when I served on the zoning commission as a city planner, but that's not the total makeup of those boards and commissions normally. They're supposed to be just regular people in the community. And what I shared with you was when I was on the zoning commission, I would get my packet maybe on, at the latest, the Friday before a Wednesday meeting the next week. I would read that packet completely. I would drive and look at some of those cases, or in some cases use Google Maps to try to get more familiar. But I don't think that you can expect volunteer citizens to spend that kind of time. If you do expect that, you're going to end up with volunteer citizens that are all retired, independently wealthy, all the things that we say we don't want in our elected representatives, because it's not a cross section of the community that you're trying to serve. And so that's challenging and difficult. And in the past, there haven't been a lot of people that want to serve on those boards and commissions. Now I think there are more. Yeah. And I am it's just over this weekend, I met several people who work for companies that are encouraging their employees to take the time to do that kind of service. But if you don't have if you're not self-employed or have an employer that's willing to let you take an entire day off of work to sit at a zoning commission meeting or a plan commission meeting for half a day or more, then that's challenging.
And it's just like the frustrating thing is like the real change needs to happen way before all the research and it gets in front of a citizen and a governmental employee. The challenge is the system itself, and should we be doing it this way?
And I would say that the public employees, the city staff in this case, they do reach out in a number of ways, and they have, all the reports that come through, say, on My Fort Worth app, and the surveys that they do about people's satisfaction with how things are happening. And all of that material goes into all that research that they do when they put together the reports that they bring to the boards and commissions and to the policymakers for final decision. So in their minds, they are getting that information from people. But if that's not explained and spelled out and described, then people who weren't contacted, because you always have one, I wasn't told about this, then you can see why. So that's frustrating. But there's something that did come up that I got from the city of Fort Worth through the city news recently, was like all their social links. And there's a place on the city's website, which I'm going to have EJ put in the show notes, because this is something that is a tool that will help you be that engaged person that we kind of highlighted at the top of the show, about how to keep up with all the things that are going on in the city, so that if there is a specific area that you're interested in, you can plug into that. And hopefully there'll be an engagement piece ahead of a final decision being made where you can, give your input and have some say on the outcome.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're now going to move into short story number 3, which we kind of already been discussing. This last week was Global Entrepreneurship Week, where basically all around the world, events and celebrations have promoting entrepreneurship in communities. Fort Worth is known to have one of the most successful and largest global entrepreneurship weeks in the country. And she was also kind of the MC of the largest event, where we brought in a guest speaker, and you can talk more about that. Well, on top of that, we also had the blockchain summit going on at the same exact time. So we had a lot of movers and shakers in town. So on Thursday, we had RFK Jr. in town. We had Andrew Yang in town for the crypto thing. We had Vivek Ramaswamy in town. So there was a lot of important people who are trying to advocate for different things and get elected right here in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm going to talk about the crypto part, and then I'll pass it over to Ann to talk about what she saw at the Global Entrepreneurship Week, since she emceed the larger event. So crypto is obviously, and Texas is the largest state to mine Bitcoin. We do more mining than the other states. Fort Worth was proud to be the first city to mine Bitcoin. Ever since then, we mined Bitcoin. Bitcoin has been cut down to half. Anyways, like, blockchain leaders are trying to shed the industry's Wild West image and advocate for clear regulation, which is kind of funny because we at Fort Worth was saying we are the Wild West, and we make that seem cool to business people when we pitch them and talk about how our city got started. But anyways, at the end of the day, I'm less interested in talking about the blockchain industry, because from a news perspective, I think that industry is still relatively new. I think it can be more successful as generative AI and all that becomes more successful. But the whole like Bitcoin piece, I still don't think we need to really be addressing. But I hope that this conference was more about the blockchain piece than the Bitcoin piece. But really why I wanted to bring this up is that it brought two people running for president here in Fort Worth, which they both had something to say about this space. And to me, that's just something we should know, is that we had the independent RFK and Vivek Ramaswamy, who's probably second or third on that list of people trying to beat Trump. So I just thought that part was cool, that we really not only were having a national conversation right here in Fort Worth, we also had national leaders here as well. Tell me about GEW and the event.
So, I felt a little like a fish out of water. I was very flattered that they wanted me to come and MC the 6th annual State of Entrepreneurship Luncheon that was held over on the near South Side at the 411. It was their flagship GEW event, and it was hosted by HSC Next, and the State of Entrepreneurship addresses city decision makers, influencers, and other leaders and founders and entrepreneurs in the community about entrepreneurship in Fort Worth and Tarrant County. So at this luncheon, I was the master of ceremonies, and Trey Bowles did the State of Entrepreneurship in Fort Worth and Tarrant County. John Deary from the Center for American Entrepreneurship was there to talk about basically kind of entrepreneurship from the national level, for like what's going on in DC and how they are working to influence policymakers in DC, so that they have the information, kind of similar to what we were just talking about with experts telling folks how to make these decisions, city staff being kind of subject matter experts. So the Center for American Entrepreneurship is like the subject matter experts that are trying to have influence on policymakers so that they're making policy decisions that are supportive of entrepreneurship. And then Maëlle Gavitt was the keynote, who was interviewed kind of in a fireside chat style by Cameron Cushman. And so that event was on Friday, and I thought that it went really well. I think it was very well received. You were there for a hot minute, but then had to go off to do your plan commission duty.
Yes. And so what was kind of the biggest take that you feel like from the event that, an average Fort Worthian should know about?
So again, like I said, I was a little bit of a fish out of water. I feel like I am supportive of the arts, but I am not artistic myself. I am supportive of small businesses and entrepreneurship, but I am not a small business owner or an entrepreneur myself. So a lot of the things that were talked about, I hope that the people in the room understood more than I understood it, because it was a lot of talk about funding. Some of the takeaways that I did think were really important is that a lot of the funding for entrepreneurship is, older white men who are funding things that are startups and things that are pitched by people that look like them and businesses that they understand. And so therefore it's like 98% of the funding goes to a very small group of, pitches. Yeah. Whereas Black and brown folks that are trying to be entrepreneurs, women who are trying to be entrepreneurs, can't get access to that funding. What was listed, or what was described by Techstars and what they try to do is go places where other people maybe are not going. Yeah. And so they talked about how, Maëlle talked about the unicorn and how that's like hitting $1 billion. But if you're only focused on hitting that $1 billion, then you might not have the sturdy foundation to have you continue in the future. So she described it as a unicorn with wobbly legs. And then she has a catchphrase of being more like a dragon. And so looking at multiple things so that you're building a strong foundation so that you will continue to be successful. But the other takeaway was that economic return is not necessarily coming from your big companies or from even existing small businesses, but from these startups. Yeah. And so that's a reason to fund these. And I think this is another example of maybe some funding that came out of COVID with ARPA dollars that we don't have necessarily a long-range plan to continue. And I think that some of that innovation that came out of that was something we should learn from and figure out how to continue to do, and not just in a crisis situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's definitely, I think, the entrepreneurship scene is still very small and trying to get bigger, but the work of the team over there at the Health Science Center and the new Tech Stars. We were once the largest city without a accelerator, and because Techstars here, that's no longer the case. So we have made progress from 2 years ago to now, and we'll just continue to see that happening. We're 30-ish minutes in. We're now hitting the big story. The big story is something that I sent Ann while heading to Connecticut, and when it was a New York Times article. And the New York Times article basically said what it means to be a Texan is changing in surprising ways. White people make up a declining minority in Texas, even among those born in the state. And all those people moving in, they are as likely to be Black, Hispanic, or Asian.
Well, what I thought was interesting about this article was that you made some comments that basically aligned with what this article said the week before this article came out. So when you sent it to me, I was like, ooh, you've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on.
Yeah, I feel like we've been saying what's cool about the New York Times article. I feel like it is a copy paste of things we've said on the 817 podcast, which for me, one is humbling because it shows that our podcast, if you're listening to it, you're a step ahead of the people who have to go listen to it to the New York Times or the Economist, right? Like at the end of the day, like, I think we are local people who live in Texas, are Texans. And so we got to see this energy. And I do my best, as much as we read the local news, I align it with the national news, which allows me to then kind of take what's happening nationally, see what's happening in Texas, and then create a POV. But what I learned from this article, I mean, they had 3 New York Times articles, journalists in Texas, traveling around Texas from Odessa to Frisco. And here's what I think is interesting of the article that they brought that's fresh and different. The New York Times collected years of census data, analyzed migration patterns, and traveled to communities across Texas to understand what is happening in the nation's second most populous state. And here's what they got. What stood out was the degree to which white Texans already has become a state of immigrants, a population that is now multi-generational. The fastest growing demographic group is made up of the children of immigrants, predominantly Texas-born Hispanics. That means that white people, who had long been the state's largest demographic group, are now outnumbered by those who are Hispanic, even among native-born Texans, a change first documented by the U.S. Census Bureau this year. So basically what that is meaning is that Texas-born Hispanics are outgrowing white-born Hispanics. So this is pre-new arrivals. And so that's pretty impressive. I like this part. It said a visitor to the state 30 years ago would have encountered 2 born and bred white Texans for every Latino born in Texas soil. Today, these groups are nearly equal size.
And I think we talk a lot about that Texas is a magnet for people moving from other states. And they, our leadership has championed that and said and boasted about it and said that we're luring people away from other places. But because Texas is so populous, migration has less of an effect than it does on other fast-growing states like Nevada and Arizona. And the composition of these domestic migrants is often misconstrued. While white professionals are indeed moving to Austin, the state is gaining 2 people of color for every white migrant. Newcomers from other states are reshaping the suburbs in surprising ways, and they talk about Frisco, which we talked about on the last pod. The city has seen an influx of white transplants to new developments in tracts of farmland, but a huge number of Asians have also been moving in. In 1990, with around 60,000 people living in Frisco, the census listed just 29 Asian residents, and now nearly a quarter of the city's 220,000 residents are Asian.
That's crazy. And when Frisco was 6,000 people, which I remember when Frisco was 6,000 people, they had 29 Asian residents, and now at over 200,000 people, a quarter of them are Asian. I think that is crazy. And then to me, this part about the black population was interesting. I did not know
that we're surpassing Georgia and Florida.
Yes, and that in Houston, black-owned businesses have been thriving when the city now rivaling Atlanta as a destination for black families and young people. And that, the black Texas leads in the growth of black population residents moving to a state. So I think that's so it's just extremely powerful to see that thrive and that people see progress here. I do think what was awesome in a perspective that these journalists were able to give that I didn't see or have any experience in is exploring time in Odessa, where the share of Latinos in the local population has nearly doubled to 56% since 1990. So Odessa is a majority Hispanic city, like the state is, but their mayor is Hispanic. And I think what it shows, though, is that he is still a conservative Republican mayor. So I also seen that dynamic about, if Texas gets more diverse, we will get more progressive. We're seeing that may not be the case because a lot of this article was talking about how these oil companies... You can't
just assume that people who are black and brown are going to be Democrats, is what they're saying. And I think, this just goes back to the purpleness of us all and how we should all be willing to work together and speak together and not just be digging our heels in and become entrenched in one side or the other. And
and they were just talking, which was good, is like these a lot of Hispanics who become conservative or are conservatives, one just from the religious perspective, and then the other two, though, is that these oil companies have now hired more Hispanics than whites. And the data here is just, I'm trying to find it here. It says, it shows here that all 80 employees of their company, Premier Energy Services, are Hispanic, reflecting a shift that has slowly transformed Texas oil-rich Western expense. Where a roughneck, the grease-stained symbol of Texas economic identity, was once typically a white man hoping to strike black gold, the average oil field worker now is a Hispanic man who was born in Texas. Just even that kind of energy of like a lot of those, if you've ever met anyone who works in oil, they really speak the Republican language because so many of their leadership and core values have always been just like conservative. And so you're having people who's like, I'm not going to go against the people who are paying my bills. And I end up voting that way too. And so you're also seeing that obviously where you work and who's your highest employer in your city, whatever the values of that organization or industry is, also then leads to people voting the way of their profession. However, it did talk about that during Governor Greg Abbott's reelection in 2022, voter margins were generally lower in counties with a high share of Texas-born Latinos. It says that Mr. Abbott handily defeated his Democratic opponent, Beto O'Rourke, but analysis of election and census data shows that in areas where the population of Texas-born Hispanics were higher, Mr. Abbott's vote share was lower, and those areas are rapidly taking over the state. So it's going to continue to be a conversation between how do Asian Americans, Black Americans, and Hispanic Americans move the election, especially in the state. And what we can see, when you weren't here for that episode, Laura O'Neill, when she was here, we talked about how Republicans are actually gaining more market share in all three of those demographic areas, but is losing on the educated white by a lot. So the educated white is plus 10% Democrats, where the Democrats are losing blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. So it's gonna be an interesting dynamic. But at the end of the day, it's always good to see the melting pot. Any other big takes from here that you see?
I mean, overall, I think it's positive to have a more diverse place. And so all of this description of the culture that is brought by either, more people of all these different cultures living in Texas, I think is positive. These are superficial things, but like the availability of a variety of types of foods and restaurants that are going to be in a place that are more diverse. The rising of sports that are outside of, Friday night lights and football, the fact that there's boxing, which is popular in a popular sport in Mexico, and cricket. And so all these different things, I think, just bring more diversity and interest. And I think that's a positive outtake of it all.
Yeah, I remember in like year one of the podcast when the lacrosse team showed up in Fort Worth, I said Fort Worth, it should have been a cricket team, so cricket's only going to continue to thrive and rise. But now the Metroplex does have a cricket team, and they play in Grand Prairie. Awesome. Well, at the end of the day, that big story was just talking about the population. You can read the article, and it just continues to go away from the cowboy stick, rural Texas. It's going to be interesting, again, going back to how do they navigate educating these kids. This is why choice and all this stuff is important, and we'll see what happens. All right, so let's go ahead and move into wins and losses. And what is your loss? We always like to start with the losses so we can end on a high note. What is your loss?
My loss is that the federal budget cuts could derail Amtrak's big plans for Fort Worth passenger rail. I will have the article in the show notes, but basically it indicates that Fort Worth's Amtrak station is like one of the most highly used stations, and there was plans with the budget that was originally going to be available to help connect Atlanta and have more frequent service to Oklahoma, and it was also going to connect to across the whole country in a more robust way. And this is all just going to be dismantled completely if this huge cut actually goes through. So, loss of public transportation in ways other than driving cars is always a loss for me. And so I'm hoping that this doesn't happen, and that because the second project they're looking at was extending the Heartland Flyer line, which currently runs between Fort Worth and Oklahoma. A possible Amtrak line between Fort Worth and El Paso was being explored. And people talk about how things cost a lot of money, and that transit costs a lot of money, and that trains cost a lot of money, and they forget how subsidized all of our other ways of getting around are. And I just think we should have another thought about where we put this money.
I sent you an article from The Economist that I think it will fire you up. So I'm excited to get your feedback on that later. So my loss is Tarrant County Public Health ends free flu shots. Tarrant County Public, this was in the Star Telegram, will not purchase, our public health office will not purchase free flu shots for adults without health insurance during the fall flu season because funding for the program has been used up. The Public Health Department offered free flu shots for adults without insurance for 3 years using emergency COVID funding. This flu season, uninsured adults will have to purchase their vaccines, which usually costs about $25. The funds provided for the COVID-19 pandemic response have been depleted, said the spokesperson, Edra Au, who was representing Tarrant County Public Health.
And in the meantime, I think our hospitals are filling up with people with RSV. So
yeah,
it seems like a proactive way to not have the bad things happen on the end.
Yeah.
And we're going to take the funding away from that. And it's going to end up costing more money in the long run.
Yeah. So just a big loss as we've always kind of talked about, the ARPA dollars and a lot of this funding provided a lot of incentives that then allowed us to have lower rates of things. I think an example of this that we talked about in the past was how crime went down. But it was because we were providing all these extra social safety nets for people through the COVID-19 era. And you have our local politicians touting how they changed crime and how they changed safety. But now all of those
things is going away.
It's going away. And it's going to be funny what they say to all of us now. But heck, they might be able to get elected next year, and just before we recognize that it was the federal government that provided those things. Now, let's I don't know, I just need to laugh. Oh, okay. Let's go ahead and move into our wins now. What is your win?
So my win was an article that the Fort Worth Report did titled "Longtime Election Judges Offer Skeptics a Front Row Look at Election Security." And I just felt like this was a really well thought out and deep dive into what actually happens at our polling places that are run by folks that have a lot of experience and have been through, in this case, a couple that have been doing this for like 19 years. And with every technological upgrade, elections have become more secure in their understanding, and their understanding is informed because they are the people that are running these elections. He said that he is very concerned with some of the mistrust of the voter process that people have been expressing, but that he feels the solution is more widespread understanding of what goes on. And they describe very specifically the challenges that they faced, which one was they arrived at their polling location to set up and they were locked out. And so they had to get in and set up very quickly. And in the minds of some conspiracy-minded folks, that might be something to get very uptight about. In my mind, knowing how when you're working with different governmental entities to use those facilities, the fact that somebody didn't show up with keys to open the door is not something that was like an intentional thing. And so I just found this really refreshing. And the fact that they've grown relationships with people who come and vote at that election location multiple years. I had the same relationship with some folks that at the Worth Heights Community Center where I often did my early voting. And so I just found it very refreshing to hear the perspective of actual election judges that are well-versed and knowledgeable, explaining all of the things that they do in order to make sure that our elections go smoothly.
People like Cal and Karen in the article give me hope. Yep. So my win is an article out of the Fort Worth Report written by David Moreno. JPS breaks ground on Cook's Children's and JPS breaks ground on Las Vegas Trail Health Center. What you see here, this is going to be for the first time a new health center in West Fort Worth. The health systems broke ground Tuesday at Las Vegas Trail Neighborhood Health Center on the corner of Calmont Avenue and Cherry Lane, a 2-story, 40,000 square foot facility that will have a food pantry, on-site job training, and a Fort Worth police outpost. The center will provide pediatric and adult medical, behavioral health, and social services to Las Vegas Trail neighborhood. The clinic will be built on 3.7 acres that were donated to Cook's Children. And so, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's been a lot of progress in Vegas Trail. I do, know that this kind of success is something that the councilman there, Michael Crane, has done a lot to make happen. And so all in all, I think that's good for his area and good for the community residents in Las Vegas Trail area.
And all of that started back with a Star-Telegram in-depth story about Las Vegas Trail. And so there's been a lot of folks that have poured into kind of addressing the underserved and other aspects of that area. There's another article which we might also put in the show notes that's similarly looking at a health center, because there is some work going on the east side to adding a health center over there. And I think that is something that we definitely need in that location as well. But if these public-private partnerships can start to make sure that these necessary health resources are in communities that have been underserved in the past, that is definitely a win.
Yep. The center is expected to open in late 2025. Awesome. Well, that wraps us up with the 817 podcast today. If you like this episode, if you learned something, give it a 5-star rating, leave a comment, a review, share it with a friend. We hope you guys have a wonderful week, and Thanksgiving week. And you got anything going on this holiday season? No. Neither do I, really. So that's exciting.
We'll be hanging out with some friends, I think. Our families are all other places, and I think we're going to hang out with some friends and hang out with some people that don't have other plans for Thanksgiving. We don't want to travel on Thanksgiving because that's just not fun.
So we are doing a pod next Sunday.
Yeah, I'll be
cool.
here.
So we'll be doing that pod because when December hits, December 15th, we'll be pretty much out for 4 to 6 weeks, as I will be out of the country. And so we want to make sure to give you as many as we can before that happens. So take care and have a good rest of the week.